Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley, and I'm the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I'd like to welcome you to the workshop, Quality Delivery in Training and Learning. This is a new workshop and it forms part of the Training Accreditation Council's education program. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Werner, who is our presenter for today. Claire has been an auto attack for many, many years, and I'm sure that you have heard or seen her before around the place, as she has wealth of knowledge. So over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Mel, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this morning on this, in Perth at least, beautiful, sunny, crisp, clear morning. I know some of you are in the eastern states because you've said good afternoon as you have said hello. So as Mel mentioned, this is our first time delivering this workshop as a webinar. We've done it once before in a face-to-face session, and people felt there was a lot of value in what we were talking about. So we would be very, very happy if you were to provide us with any feedback about the workshop and how you think we might improve it. And there's some contact details at the end of the slide. So when you think about our sector, we are a sector that is really, really heavily focused on assessment, but the vast majority of training organisations of RTOs actually provide training and assessment. And we have a very light touch at the moment in our regulation around training, and the whole idea of this workshop is that we put a little bit more focus on that and look at the points that we have got here on the slide. So we're going to think about what quality teaching and learning actually looks like in practice. We often say the words, but do we really understand what that means? We're going to look at learning and its implication for our practice as a trainer, what to think about when you're actually choosing an approach for your learner group, because they're all very different, how to plan teaching and learning, approaches to structuring on-the-job learning, because again, in our sector, a lot of learning actually happens in the workplace. How you might be able to support the workplace to support your learners, and resources that could help you to support training in the classroom and the workplace. So in the materials that were sent out to you, you would have had a handout, and we will certainly be referring to that handout throughout the session. You need to have access to that. So if you could please make sure that you've got that close. So we have got 2 hours together this morning, or this afternoon if you happen to be in the eastern states. So I think we shouldn't waste any more time and we should get started. So quality is certainly something that we strive for in the vet sector. We want to provide the best teaching, learning and assessment experience that we can for the learners that choose our RTOs. But just what this term means, what quality means in the vet sector, is pretty elusive, and we have actually been trying for years and years to define what quality means. And we don't actually have a commonly accepted definition of quality yet in our sector. The reality is that for each of us, quality most likely has a different meaning, and that really is about the context in which we think about quality. It's like, what am I trying to achieve? So am I trying to, for example, engage disengaged students? Am I addressing a particular industry need? Am I trying to make a profit in my organisation? Am I trying to build the bench strength of my organisation? Am I targeting career changes? And depending on how you answer those questions, what you are going to value or think of as quality in that particular situation is actually likely to be different. And you are going to structure your training and assessment to help you achieve whatever that outcome is that you are aiming for. So what works really well and might be considered quality in one context won't necessarily work as well or be considered as quality in another context. And I'll give you an example. So many years ago now, I was involved in an audit which was looking at organisations who were in receipt of public funding. And these organisations had been flagged for audit because they had very low completion rates in their qualifications. One of the organisations that I actually visited had a 0% completion rate. And if we all had our cameras on, I think I'd probably seen you do the scream right now. 0% sounds horrendous, right? But let me tell you, I had actually never ever seen such valuable training and assessment as what was being done by that organisation. It was exceptional. So this was an organisation that was working in a remote Aboriginal community, and there were some really significant child health and development and, very sadly, mortality issues in that community. And in trying to address those issues, what the community had done is they had partnered with this RTO to provide training to the young mums in the community and whoever else, you know, wanted to come along to the training as well. And that was focused on health, hygiene, understanding developmental milestones, nutrition, play, all the things that we would want, you know, young mums to understand. So the RTO would actually spend weeks at a time in the community delivering this training, and the outcomes were measured by how many visits the children had to the community health centre, how many developmental milestones were being met by the children. So it was training that was collaborative, it was culturally appropriate, it was targeted, it was responsive, and it worked in the community. So by all of the really important measurements or outcomes that we could be looking for, the training was exceptional. By the other measure, what's the completion rate in the qualification, the training was being questioned. So context is really, really important when we think about quality, and I want you to take that away with you from today as you're thinking about quality in your organisations. So many, many times before, if I have met you before, if I've spoken to you before, if you've come to one of these webinars, you've probably heard one of us say, there's no such thing as one size fits all. Different things work in different organisations, and the same is going to be said again today. So it's not like we haven't tried to define quality. We have. There's been a whole pile of research that has been done around quality in the vet sector, which of course is an incredibly diverse and complex sector. And really what we have found is that what we have been able to do is, rather than define quality, is define the characteristics that are present when we have quality training and assessment. So NCVR recently released some research which summarised a lot of that. The link that is on the screen there and that Mel has just put in the chat box is the link to the full paper. But fundamentally, what they did was they identified 4 characteristics that would be in place if you had a quality teaching and learning experience. So the first of those was that it was transformational. And what this is about is it's about how well the students are achieving and developing throughout the teaching and learning experience. Student-centred is about how well the students are supported and encouraged to learn, and this is a really important statement, encouraged to learn. That the training would be fit for purpose, so how well the stakeholders' needs and purposes are met in the training, and that it's evolutionary, which means how well the delivery adapts to changing stakeholder or workplace or industry needs. So it's not set in concrete, it's something that grows and changes and morphs as it needs to. So when we know that these are the characteristics that are present when an outcome might be considered a quality outcome, the trick for us is really to know what those things look like on the ground in practice on a day-to-day basis. So this is where we start to put you to work. And we're going to ask you that question. What does quality look like in practice on a day-to-day basis? So let me give you an example. If we were to say, let's maybe think about something being student-centered, and I say the question, well, what would I see on the ground? So it might be something like you have an interview process as part of your enrolment where you identify the needs of the learner, where they're at, and what kind of supports you might need to put in place. It could be that you have mentors or buddies on the ground to support students throughout their learning journey. There are quite literally hundreds of things that you might see. So what we want you to do is think about what this might look like on the ground. What does quality look like in the ground? And we want you to write your responses to that question in the chat box. You'll have about 3 minutes to do that, and then we will talk about what you have popped in the chat box. Okay, so thank you so much for putting all of those responses there in the chat box. There are some real themes in what you are adding to that box. So there is a lot of information that you have put in there that's around the design of the learning, and the design of that learning being student focused, and that we're actually using an instructional design process to do that. And that designed for the learner not only touches the learning aspect, but also the assessment aspect and the support processes as well. There's also a number of you have talked about optimizing results for the learners, and that what you are doing is aimed at making sure that you are meeting a standard, whatever that standard might be. You've talked about the training environment there. You've talked about reasonable adjustment quite a lot. And you've also talked about the people who deliver the training and assessment. You've talked about it in various ways. So cohesive teams, qualified trainers and assessors, those people being supportive and engaging lecturing team. So there are lots of common themes throughout what you have put down there. And there's a couple that I think is well worth just touching on, because they sit outside those things, but they're really important things to do. So Mary, you have written think like a student. Now, this is something I say in audits all the time. Put yourself in the student's shoes. How would you feel if this was happening to you? What do you think they would want in these circumstances? So I think that's a very, very important point that you have put in there. And I'm just trying to flick back through. You'll recognise yourself as soon as I say it, but also someone has talked about being inclusive in there, and it's a very important thing to consider, because, you know, depending upon your lens, and we all have a different lens, what you consider to be inclusive will be different. And I had a fabulous example that I heard just last week with a team of people who do a lot of work with the Antarctic Division. And they were actually talking about the uniforms that are given to everyone who works in the Antarctic Division, and basically their overalls. And when people who are working in that division actually have to go out for the day and they're doing their research, around the camps in Antarctica, they have basically shipping containers that are set up as bathrooms. And when it's minus 40 degrees and you're a male going to the bathroom, the overall works quite well for you. But if you're a female going to the bathroom in minus 40 degrees, that basically means you have to take your clothes off. And so something as simple as just what kind of uniform you get given can make a practice feel inclusive or not inclusive at all. So it's actually a really important thing to remember, and it's an important thing to ask your learners about. So you have also, a lot of you have also put in there about meeting the unit of competency requirements, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So when I look at all of the things that you have put there, I think that we basically have a reasonably consistent understanding of maybe what quality practice might look like on the ground. And when we're talking about quality practice, we're talking about learning. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that learning was a really important phrase for us to focus on. And that's what we're going to do next, is think about learning. Here's an interesting idea for you. We know through research that how people think or define learning impacts directly on how effective their learning is. So if you have a narrow or factory definition of learning, that will likely be the limit of your learning. And this idea of learning really emerged out of the Industrial Revolution, and it shaped the way many of our educational institutions are structured and also how they operate. And, you know, it's really that sausage factory idea that you put someone in, you do exactly the same thing to them, and they'll come out with the same skills. And we all know that doesn't work. So as our study into learning progressed, there were a number of theorists who really challenged this idea, and Ausubel is one of them. And he was one of the first people to really distinguish between rote learning and meaningful learning. So the former, or rote learning, it's easy to acquire, but it's temporary and it requires constant refreshing. And if you think back, like if you're of my generation and you think back to school, we would all have experienced rote learning. We had to stand up behind our chairs in the morning and we had to spell the 100 demons and recite the times tables. The second, meaningful learning, actually takes longer to acquire, but it's long-lasting and it facilitates transfer and creativity. So very early on, I'm talking back in the 50s, we had this distinguishing between different types of learning. In 1979, there was a really seminal piece of work by an educational psychologist, Roger Salyer. And what he did, and many people consider him to be the pioneer of contemporary learning theory, was he looked at what we thought learning was, and he categorized those things into 5 categories. And they're the categories that you can see on the screen in front of you. So he talked about learning as a quantitative increase in knowledge. So learning is about acquiring information or knowing a lot. Learning is memorizing. It's storing information that can be reproduced. Learning how to spell the 100 demons. Learning how to recite the times tables. That learning is acquiring. It's about acquiring facts and skills and methods that can be retained and used as necessary. Now, that line there, learning is acquiring, is the start of a different way of thinking about learning. Learning is making sense or abstracting meaning, which means we can relate parts of the subject matter to each other and to the real world. And learning is interpreting and understanding reality in a different way. And this involves us comprehending the world by reinterpreting the knowledge that we have. So when we look at what is sitting there and what's really important in this is that what we got was that learning wasn't just an outcome, which is the first 2, But learning is a process as well. So why is that so important for us? The reason it's so important is because what is taught is not always the same as what is learnt. So students are not empty vessels waiting to be filled. They are individuals who come to our learning experiences with a really diverse set of experiences and skills that always add to the learning experience. It impacts what they hear, how they interpret the information, and the activities that are therefore useful for them when you are structuring and designing learning. The second reason why that is so important is that traditional views and assumptions often drive us to a really narrow focus on tangible outcomes, and we should broaden that. We often think about learning very narrowly. We focus on tangible outcomes which represent things such as assignments and exams. And we should be thinking about the opportunities that we have for our students to gain that knowledge and skill, but also to pick up all of those other skills that in fact make them a great worker in the workplace. It's important to distinguish between trainer objectives, what am I going to teach them, as well as student objectives, what would I like to learn? And for all of us, we have adults in our classrooms. They have agency and they'll come with a desire to learn particular things. So if we think about, what makes someone a great worker, there's lots of frameworks that we already use within our sector that help us with that. So for example, the core skills for work. Things like interacting with others, getting the work done, they're all things that we could include in the learning process if we think about it more broadly. And finally, learning is often taken for granted, but it's really too ambiguous a concept to articulate in a single sentence. There are more than 50 theories of learning that exist, and it's really up to us to take what we know, to pull it apart and to ultimately form new ideas and understandings about learning, and importantly to use those things to inform our practice. So we as trainers have to be learners as well, and we need to constantly build this into the way that we work. So now we move on to thinking about how we might apply this in our own practice. So where do we start? Well, there's some questions on the screen here. If we have a consistent understanding of what a quality outcome might look like, then it's our task as vet professionals to design and implement learning experiences that are going to achieve that outcome that we're seeking. Generally, there's a series of questions that we would ask and address to inform our work, and you'll see they're divided into two blocks. So firstly, that first question, what does the cohort need to learn and how will we know that they have learnt it, is a really important question, and we need to answer that before we answer anything else. Because when we think about what does the cohort need to learn, when we answer that question, the answer is not always going to involve training. Sometimes the best way for someone to learn something is, in fact, to do it in another way. It might be through workplace shadowing, for example, not coming to a training course. So if we are able to answer that first question and it involves training being involved, then we start to answer the questions that sit in the second blocks. So what training are we delivering? Why are we doing it? Who are we delivering the training to? What are the learning objectives? What's the best way to deliver to this cohort? And putting a plan in place that covers all of the things above. So we're going to work through those one by one, and we'll use an example to do that. So let's say we have a group who need to learn something. What they need to learn is to work more safely and to manage risk in their work environment. We need to think about what the learning outcome is that we want to achieve. So in our world, units of competency describe the work outcome, the workplace outcome. They don't actually tell us what the learning objectives are. So that's a really important thing to understand. What you see written in the units of competency are not learning objectives, they are workplace standards. So while we need to clearly understand the unit so that we can understand what that workplace outcome is, we also need to think about what we need to teach someone so that they can get to that workplace outcome. So we've said we have got a group of people who need to work more safely in their workshop. And what you have got on the screen in front of you is probably something every single one of us have seen. So we have a risk assessment matrix sitting there where we're looking at the probability of a risk occurring and the implications of what happens if it does occur. Nearly every resource that I have seen over, and Mel's been very kind to me, not telling you how many years I've been doing the audits, but I can tell you in the 38 years that I have worked in the vet sector as a trainer and assessor and also as an auditor, nearly every unit that has occupational health and safety, or now workplace health and safety in its title, has got this matrix in its learner guide. It usually sits in a discrete section, risk assessment, and generally after you see this risk matrix, you'll see the triangle that sits on the other side. This is the hierarchy of controls. So when you have a look at these two things, you might be lucky to get a description of what probability and severity means. You might have a description of what elimination engineering controls, PPE, means. But what I almost never see in these materials is any kind of information or instruction or help for the learners about how to actually apply these things in the workplace. So they never get taught to do it. They know what it is, but they don't know how to use it. And we see that in the answers that we see to questions around this, where people are doing a risk assessment and they will change, for example, the wrong part of the assessment matrix based on the control that they have put in place. So they might have a control that is about PPE, which is about reducing the probability that something would happen, but when you see what they've changed the severity of the outcome. So what we really need to do is make sure that we can actually set objectives in place for whether or to get people to the point where they can do this risk assessment, put controls in place, and make their workplace a safer workplace. So when we're thinking about objectives like that, what we're actually thinking about is writing what we would call a SMART objective. And many of you have probably heard this term before. So this is telling us that we should be writing learning objectives that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, hence the SMART. So specific means it says exactly what the learner will be able to do at the end of the session. Measurable means it can be observed by the end of the training session. So something like a term understanding is not measurable. It has to be attainable or achievable. This means that the participants can actually do it within the scheduled time frame and in the specified conditions. Relevant means that it needs to be relevant to the needs of the participant and the organisation. And time framed means it's achievable by the end of the training session, whatever that session time frame is. So if we think back to our example, we have got a couple of examples here. So the first question is, learners will understand risk, or the first objective that was written is learners will understand risk assessment. And our question to you is this a SMART objective or not, yes or no? So Mel set up a poll for us there. If you could vote yes or no as to whether that first objective is a SMART objective. Okay, so we're starting to see some responses there. At the moment, 84 people sitting on the fence, which is okay. People have said yes, and 36 people have said no to that first one. So if we applied those definitions, SMART, and we think about probably the one that stands out most in that first example is measurable. So I gave you a little hint earlier where I said understand is not measurable. So if we were to say, if this is this a SMART objective, could we measure this, that the learners will understand risk assessment? We would probably say no. We don't have any time frames in there, and it's not really very specific either. So as a SMART objective, I'm probably going to agree, as you can tell by the red circle, with the 36 people who said no and say this is not a great SMART objective. When it comes to the next one, and I won't ask you to do a poll on this one, oh, I will because Mel has already set it up, is, I don't know about the others, but I can't see that objective anymore, Mel. It sits across the screen, but that objective, at the end of the session, learners will be able to choose control measures that will reduce risk in the mechanical workshop. Do we think that's a good SMART objective? So you can vote yes, no, or maybe. Okay, so 22 people have said yes, it's a reasonable SMART objective. 24 people have said maybe, and 6 have said no. So it's certainly more specific than the objective before. We have got them being able to choose control measures that are going to reduce risk in the workshop. So we are going to be able to measure that. It's achievable. I guess the question is it relevant? And it's certainly time bound. So relevance is the one that is questionable here. And the reason for that is because we need to be able to have them doing a risk assessment properly for them to be able to choose control measures. So we're getting better, but we're not there yet. And this is where I am handing over to you. So I would like you to write a SMART objective that's going to make us all smile, and to use the chat box to write your objective in, to share your objective with us. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do that. And then, so it's now 10:40, so we'll come back at 10:45 and we will see what SMART objectives you have written for us, and hopefully we will all be smiling. So we will see you in 5 minutes. Okay, well, we've certainly got some objectives in there that have made me smile, and I'd like to come for the walk too so that I can get rewarded with blueberries. That would be great. So apart from smiling at some of these, what you have done there is you've been far more specific. You have put measures in there that we can look to at the end of the session, and you have also put timeframes in there as well. So they include things like in 6 months by walking 30 minutes every day, Bernays the onion in 2 minutes. You have put measurements in there like identifying 3 hazards or 3 controls. So that is really good. When you think about these objectives, and some of you have done this too, is that it might not be one objective. You might not be able to get all of this in one objective. There might be 3 or 4 things that students will build on to get to the point where they can do what it is you need them to be able to do. But the point is, when you are thinking about objectives which are about learning, that you do actually define what they are, and then you structure the learning around what those objectives are. So thank you so much for putting all of your objectives in there. Right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, of course, this learner group that we have. And we've mentioned it a couple of times already, different learner groups. They have different characteristics. And choosing the right way to provide learning to a learner group really means that you have to understand them. And so, therefore, there are going to be some things that you will ask about to help you understand this learner group. And you've got a list on the slide in front of you, which is things like the demographics of the group characteristics, the context that the learner is working within, expectations that they might have as learners, what prior knowledge or skills might they have, what is the attitude of the learner group. And I'm sure all of you have been in a classroom where you have asked someone why they're here, and you've had a crossed arms response with, I've been sent here, I've been told I have to be here. So what's the attitude? What are their learning preferences? What technical skills might need to be in place? Have we considered accessibility? And of course, what are the barriers to learning? Now this is where I need you to get your handouts out. So on page 1 and 2 of your handouts, you can see that those same headings are sitting in a table. And in that table, we've got a number of possible questions that you could ask related to that heading. So, for example, in group characteristics, one of the questions is, are they geographically dispersed? And the third column that sits in that table is, what is the implication for training then? So if you have someone who is, or a group that is geographically dispersed, you might choose to use a technology option to actually conduct the training like we're doing today. What's the level of urgency for this training? This might affect the timetabling of the training. So for example, you might have an intensive course of 1 week rather than having 5 days spread out over 5 months, coming once a month. What kind of people are they? Are they introverts, extroverts, personalities? Other qualities such as being empathetic or really driven people. If you have a group of driven extroverts, they're not going to want to read. If you have a group of introverts and extroverts, it'll be really important for you to organise the way you do group work so that we have a share of who's doing the work in that group and who is talking in that group. Do they have previous knowledge on the topic? If your group do have previous knowledge on the topic, it's important to establish what they already have, make sure it's consistent, and then move on to building on that knowledge as quickly as possible. And I can just see that Mark has also shared a handout there, so thank you so much for that, Mark. That's great. So the idea with this table is, of course, that you use it to think about your learner group. So what we want you to do is actually think about the learners that come to your RTO. So we want you to choose one of the qualifications that is delivered by your training organisation. Consider who the typical learner group is for that qualification, and using the tables on page 1 and 2 of your handout, answer some of the questions for your learner group. So consider what implications your responses would have for that, for the training for that group. And then we want you to use the chat box to record at least one example of a possible question that you're answering, what your answer is for your client group, and what the implications are for your training. So, for example, you might have chosen age. You are then going to write what your answer is to that and what the implication is for that in the chat box. Now, it will give you up to 10 minutes to do this activity. And I will be here, so if you want to ask questions, then please do so while you're doing this activity. So 10 minutes, well, let's say 8. Let's bring it back at 11 o'clock. Okay, welcome back. It's now 11 o'clock, and there are some great responses to those questions in the chat box there. I hope you've all been watching them as they have been appearing. So there are lots of comments in there that sit around what time do people have for learning, how much time do they get in the workplace, how much time sits in their free time, whether they can engage with flexible learning, how you might mix up groups when you have very experienced and inexperienced people in the same session, also how you keep those people engaged when they already have a lot of information about or a lot of knowledge or skill around the topic already. You've also dealt with things like people's prior expectations or perceptions of what training might be like. So there are a lot of really great answers in there. Thank you so much for putting those in there. Understanding your learner group and what the objectives are, how they might react, it's the key to answering the next question, which is what kind of approaches might we be able to use with a particular learner group. So there are a million different ways that you could, in fact, teach people whatever it is you wanted to teach them. And on page 3 of your handout, you're going to find a list of teaching methods that's actually come from one of the US universities, but you can find similar lists anywhere. And you'll see that there is a vast list of approaches that you might be able to take and use. Now, the idea is that when we look at a list like that, we choose things from those lists that suit the groups that we have, that we understand. So let's think about that. Sorry, I've just been distracted by Adrian's comment there about students in conservation and ecological management. And maybe afterwards I'll send you a message about that. There's nothing bad in what you've said. It's just it's an interesting take on how people interact with things when they have a deep interest in them. So putting it all together, choosing a method. So we have got two different groups of students here. So our first group of students are school leavers and they're very tech savvy. They're keen to learn quickly and get into the workplace because they want to earn some money for themselves. And in our context where we're looking at this risk assessment example that we used earlier, they have no prior experience of risk assessment. So we also have another group where we've got career changers who are also tech savvy. They want to understand the ins and outs of the work and be challenged by it. They have 25 years experience in a range of hospitality workplaces, which actually includes conducting risk assessments. So our first group, keen, tech savvy, don't have a lot of experience. Our second group, keen, tech savvy, have a lot of experience. So what might we do for these different groups? So in group one, you might, for example, choose to get them to maybe create a little video on the topic. So they would have to do some research and use their tech skills to create a video, and you might even make it of a length that sits in with the technology platforms that they use these days, so a short video. This might be a good opportunity to use a think, pair, share, where we put two minds together to come up with answers to questions that are posed to the group. Or group work or paired activities might also be great for this type of cohort because they also don't have to expose themselves as individuals when they stand up to respond to questions. So group work and paired activities actually tends to work pretty well for them. Group two, where they want to get into the details of everything, you might get them to do a research project that sits around a case study. You might get them to do some storytelling because they, in fact, have lots of experience in the workplace, and they could use that storytelling around a whole lessons learned type approach. So there's many different ways that you could address the needs of those different client groups. So now we want you to think about the client groups, your client groups that you have identified. So again, you have got this page in your handout. It's on page 4. And we want you to consider your learner group. What are their characteristics? What type of instructional strategies might work well for your learner group to achieve the objectives? And many of you have also put a little bit about what the objectives are in the first responses that you put into the chat box. And again, we want you to use the chat box to share your thoughts around what you think might work really well for your client group. So you've got about 5 minutes to do that. So let's bring it back at 11:15 for you to answer these questions. What type of instructional strategies would work well for your group? Okay, so welcome back. We're sitting at 11:15 now. There are some really interesting comments that you have put in that chat box. So a lot of you have talked about the use of technology in some way in what you might do for your groups, whether that be using videos or presentations, infographics, not using bulk text, like we often see in learner guides that are purchased from commercial providers in many instances. A lot of you have also talked about the learners not necessarily wanting or being good at spending a lot of time sitting in classrooms and presentations. They actually want to interact with what it is they're being taught, and so you might do a lot of practical skills, guided practice, and a number of you have also put in their reflection or analysis of practical skills. And this is an incredibly important thing for all of us to do as learners, reflecting on what went well and what didn't go so well in whatever it is that you are doing is a really important way for people to learn. And it doesn't matter if you are like one of the vet and school students that's being talked about in some of these responses, or if you're a university professor. Reflection, or the technical term metacognition, is important for all of us to do. So thank you again for putting all of those comments in there. There is a little wealth of information in there that I hope you have picked up as you have gone through, added your comment, but watched what some of the others are writing as well. So I'm just going to pick up one of those things. Hannah, you have written in there about scaffolding of learning, and a number of others, a number of the rest of you have said similar things, not quite use the same technology, but it's exactly the same concept. And it's actually an important segue to what we talk about next, which is when you're going to plan the learning, plan how these activities are happening, how would you do that? So in the vet sector, we have got a mandatory document that exists, which is called a training and assessment strategy. And that strategy can take different forms, but every RTO has to have one for the training products that they're offering to their learners. Now, those training and assessment strategies tend to be, or they are, high-level documents that really provide an overview of how that training product is going to be delivered. And from, I'll talk to you about it from two perspectives. From an auditor's perspective, most of the training and assessment strategy documents that we see aren't that useful because they're very generic, they're not living documents, and they're not used by anyone in the organisation other than for scoping. So that's why TAC has got a webinar and a fact sheet about writing training and assessment strategies to move a little bit away from that, to move a lot away from it actually. But from a trainer's perspective also, you need that strategy to be a bit of a guiding document. And for a lot of them, they don't give you enough detail, but they also don't link sufficiently to what would sit below it. So if I'm delivering a qualification, I can look at the strategy and I can see where what I'm doing fits into the bigger picture of the delivery of the qualification, but I might only be teaching 2 or 3 units out of that qualification. So in that strategy document, it's likely to talk to me about what kind of assessment methods might be used. It's likely to tell me in a very broad terms what kind of activities you might engage with in the classroom. It might give me a time frame. It might say this unit's got 40 hours. But it's not going to give me, as a trainer, the detail that I then need to walk into that training or learning session and be able to do my thing as a trainer. So the thing that would help me do that is actually a session plan or a lesson plan. Now, the vast majority, and I'm talking probably 90% of plans that I see for delivery are really only content lists. And Mel has put the fact sheet and the webinar on training assessment strategies in the chat box for you. So they're content lists, and when I talk about that, I should probably actually even call them content bullet points, because that's all they tell me. Very few of them actually structure or plan the learning that is going to happen in the session, and they provide really little or no guidance for the trainer. Often there's no session plan at all. There's simply the learning resources. So it might be a learner guide and a PowerPoint that you get given, and nothing else. So I will often get a mapping document that shows me how the RTO is using those learning resources to link to what's in the unit of competency. And when I use that mapping to try and see the linkages, parts of the learning guide and what's in the PowerPoint are actually often identical, absolutely identical. There's often a voluminous number of PowerPoint slides, and at that point it's really clear to anybody who is a trainer that they're not using those slides. There's too many of them. It's not possible to use those slides and create an environment where anyone might actually learn. So as an example, I saw a course not too far back, which was on gas test atmospheres, and some of you might even deliver that unit. So this was a 3-hour course for the delivery and assessment, and they had 138 PowerPoint slides that were mapped to the unit to say we've got all the learning resources that are required. So when you think about those 3 hours, and you take out the hour for assessment, and you take out 15 minutes for an introduction, and you take out 15 minutes for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and a bicky at morning tea or afternoon tea time, what you're actually left with is 90 minutes for those 138 slides. So about every 40 seconds, if they were using those slides, the learner is being faced with a text-rich slide, and they might read a couple of bits of it, and then it flicks on to the other one. So is the learner going to understand, take anything in, be able to use the information that sits in those slides? Not likely. In those circumstances, when we then talk to the people who do the training and we say, what do you actually do in the classroom? I'm not sure how you would use these. The most common answer is we don't. So typically what happens is there's some discussion, there is some demonstration. They might look at a few of those key slides. Maybe there's a video. They might do some practice on using the instruments to actually test the atmospheres. And that's actually what you would expect to happen. And that is what should be sitting in a session plan. It would actually guide the trainers about what to do. It would give the RTO some assurance that it doesn't matter who stands in front of the group delivering that course, that they're going to have some kind of consistent learning experience that's going to enable them to actually use these instruments in situations that are actually life-threatening. So while there is no set format for how you might do a session plan, there are actually lots of options for you. We've got a couple of them sitting on the slide in front of you. So often these days you will see what's going to happen in a course, especially if they're using PowerPoints, in the notes in the PowerPoint slide. So the example you've got in front of you is one of the slides that sits in one of TAC's workshops, and I can promise you that the slides I've got sitting in front of me, in fact, have exactly the same thing in them. I have got all the text here for what I'm going to talk to you about and when I'm going to get you to do things. So in this one, you can see that they have put in what tasks are going to happen. They've put in the chat box task, and then they have put in the key points that want to be drawn from the discussion that happens in the chat box, and when to move on and when to do other things. So this is quite typical of how you might see things done these days. The other example that you have got sitting there is probably what we would call a more traditional session plan. And in this one, they're talking about the delivery method that's going to be used. In this little snapshot, we've got a presentation and a video that are going to be used. And it points us to the slide that we're going to use, and it gives key talking points for the trainer about what they're going to talk about in each of those things. You're directed to a video. Then they've got a group activity, and so you can see how it is all going to work. So if I am a trainer walking into an organisation that is going to give me either of these two plans to work from, I have a great starting point for figuring out how I am going to deliver this training. And it's not to say you can't do it your way when you have a plan like this, but you have a great starting point. And it doesn't really matter, you know, what it looks like, who you are as a trainer. Everyone is going to put their own little spin on how to actually do it when they get face-to-face. And of course, you're going to be responding to the group that you have in front of you. So the other thing that you will find when you put session plans in place like this, and when we think back to those other documents that are mandatory for us in the vet sector, the training and assessment strategy, then what you'll find is that in the process of actually designing, when you do these session plans, these are the kinds of things that then will allow you to go back and complete that strategy, calculate things like the amount of training, because you'll know what you're going to do and how long it's going to take you, and of course to put in some accurate information about what the approaches are that you're going to use for delivery for the group. And ideally, your training and assessment strategy would point you to where the session plans are as a trainer and assessor. So putting a plan in place, while it's not something that sits in our regulation at the moment as a compliance requirement, if you want to be a good trainer, do a plan. So a lot of what we have talked about so far is really focused on what happens in a classroom or institutional-based delivery. And of course, in the vet sector, a lot of our training happens in the workplace. And some of you have, in fact, talked about that already in some of the examples that you have given. So let's think a little bit more seriously about what happens if this training is happening in the workplace. When we do that, what we're doing is we're enlisting another organisation, the workplace, to actually help us with the learning and the practice, and those people are generally not learning and assessment professionals. So it becomes important for us as the trainers and assessors, the learning professionals, to structure what is done from a learning perspective in the workplace. Now, if you think about this, and you have probably all seen this, think about apprenticeships and traineeships and work placements. Often what happens is we give someone a workbook, and most often it's structured for a classroom delivery or to be under the guidance of a trainer and assessor, and it's not. Or we give people links to websites without any instruction about what to do or the information that might be useful to them. Now, if you did that to me, like if you gave me a list of websites that you wanted me to go and look at without any instruction, the most likely outcome would be I'd probably come away with 2 or 3 pairs of new shoes and very little knowledge about what you actually wanted me to learn. So we need to think about when we are actually collaborating with a workplace and a learner to put learning in place in a workplace, what kind of information we need to provide to each of those three parties to make sure that the learning outcome is actually achieved. So what might we need to consider? So generally there's 6 things that we need to understand really well for us to structure learning in the workplace. Those things are, we need to understand what the actual work is in the workplace. We need to understand the staff that exist in the workplace, what their roles are, how they can help us. We need to understand the site and the equipment and the work practices of the workplace. We need to understand the learning that needs to happen, the time that is available, and we need to understand the learner themselves. So when we think about each of those things, there's probably a series of questions that we would need to ask to help us. So I'll just give you a few examples. Yes, Natalie, the culture of the workplace is incredibly important. And I'm going to ask you to write down some of these questions in a minute. So if we think about just that first one, the work. So when we look at units of competency, and someone has actually already said this in the chat box, a unit of competency sitting by itself often doesn't reflect what happens in a workplace. You often have to group units together, and sometimes there are things that happen outside of that. We need to understand what the full scope of work is in an organisation. And the reason that we have chosen this picture for you is because it's a great example. So obviously this is a mine site. And if we're thinking about mechanical maintenance, for example, so like your heavy diesel mechanic, when you look at that apprenticeship, we have major miners like BHP and Rio having to actually send their apprentices off-site to enable them to complete what sits in their units of competency. On a mine site, production is king. So the rule is you get the broken machine back in the pit as fast as you can. That means that you typically don't fix the broken component, you replace it. So a machine will come out, they'll figure out what bit's broken, they put a new bit on, and the machine goes back into the mine. The broken bit gets sent to equipment manufacturers for them to look at it and then say, yes, this piece is worth fixing, and then fix it, or no, it's not. So when you look at the scope of work for a particular apprenticeship, let's say it was for this diesel mechanic, the workplace is not going to have the full scope of work that's required in the unit of competency. So you have to start thinking about where the apprentice has to go to actually get the experience that they need to get. And this happens in lots of different industries. Another question might be, is the work cyclical? So for example, if this plant maintenance was happening in a sugar mill, well, maintenance happens in cycles. Maintenance happens when they're not processing sugarcane. Maintenance happens when the sugarcane is growing, not once it's started to be cut and processed. So when we think about the work that happens and the timing that happens in a workplace, we have to understand that fully to figure out how we might structure things. So let's think a little bit more broadly about this and do it as a group. So in your handouts, you're going to find on page 5 a table that has got each of those categories, 6 categories in it. And what I want you to do, and you're going to do one depending upon what the first letter of your name is what questions would you want to ask or understand from the workplace in each of those categories? And this is where Natalie and Darren, the comments that you've put in, are going to feed into the questions that you might actually write in here. So each of you is going to write questions for one of those categories. If your name begins with C, me, Claire, I would be asking questions for category 1, the work. If my name was Robert, I would be looking at number 5, and I would be writing the questions for time, for the category time. So depending upon your names, and I can see we've actually got a pretty good spread of names in the list in front of us, what I want you to do is to spend the next 5 to 7 minutes thinking about what questions you would want to ask for the category that you are answering the question for. Once you have written down maybe your top 2 or 3 questions, I want you to put those in the chat box. So tell us what category you are answering the question for and what those questions are. So for example, you might put category 1, the work, and then your 2 questions. Okay, it's now 11:36, so that 7 minutes, I'm testing my maths brain at this time on a Friday, means that we are going to come back at about 11:45 with your answers to those questions. So again, we'll be here to answer questions, and we will see you back here at 11:45 with your list, your top 2 or 3 questions for the category you are responding to. Okay, so welcome back. We have got some fabulous questions in the chat box there. Thank you so much for sharing all of those. If you are in an organisation where you do workplace learning, we don't have to worry about spelling, Amanda, don't worry about it. Then it's worthwhile having or making note of some of the questions that have been asked. There's some really good questions. So when you think about all of those things that you are going to ask, it's that start of collaboration with what is actually happening, or your engagement with the workplace where you're getting these answers. Now, when we think of collaborating with the workplace and the learner, the most common feedback that I get when I talk to both RTOs and workplaces is that they don't really know what happened with the learner in the other place. So workplaces don't really know what they've learned in the RTO, and RTOs don't really know what they've been practicing or doing in the workplace. And it's really important to acknowledge that when a learner is in the workplace, there's going to be a whole lot of, we might call it unintentional learning, that actually takes place that's incredibly valuable and supplements what has been planned for in the structured learning. So getting the big picture about what has actually been done and what's been learned is really important for you as a trainer assessor and as a designer as you structure what comes next for that learner. When the 3 parties don't share information about what it's been done, it's really, really hard to optimize the opportunity that the workplace provides, and it is huge. So we need to start to think about how can we share information between all 3 parties when you've got someone doing a traineeship, an apprenticeship, or there's some kind of substantial work placement. Now, yes, that is a good point, Amanda, too, because sometimes well, lots of times actually trainees and apprentices also swap employers, or if they're working with a group training organisation, they might go to a number of host employers over their apprenticeship, and you've got to have this information to make that work. Okay, so if you go to your handout and go to page 6, you're going to see an example there of the way one organisation has decided to share information between the RTO, the apprentice, and the workplace. So this example is for a mechanical apprenticeship, and it's to do with the workplace task of inspecting and servicing engines. And so what you can see is that this is filled out over a period of time. In fact, they do this weekly in this organisation. And what they have got in the first column of that table is what you might expect that learner to be doing throughout the week. So they're doing things like cleaning and inspecting the crankcase breathers on an engine. I have no idea what that means, but they do. Changing the oil in an engine, changing oil filters, taking oil samples for analysis, and completing work packs. Then what the apprentice does is they fill out how they have done that. So the rest of that top part of the table is filled out by the apprentice. So they're going to tell you how they did that work. So did they help others with the work? Or did they do it under direct supervision? Or did they do it basically by themselves with just very general supervision? And they get to put some comments in there about what they liked or disliked about the learning. So for example, in this case, they enjoyed being hands-on and learning from Steve, whoever Steve might be. They have put the work pack number that they worked on in there, so you can see what has been done by accessing their internal systems and having a look at that work pack. The next part is actually filled out by their supervisor. So these are more generic type things that you might expect feedback on. So did they do these things? Never, some of the time, most of the time, or consistently. So it's about how good a worker they have been. And the last bit of this is the tradesperson's feedback. And so you get information about whether they're progressing as you would expect, and if not, what's stopping that progression from actually happening. So in this case, we know that this person has missed work. They've missed a day and a half of work this week. So they've not progressed as we would have liked them to. And so it tells us what they're going to do about it. So in the next week, they're going to put them with John Jones all week and focus on mastering the basics. So what we get is a really clear picture of what is going to happen. So this form was created by the RTO in consultation with the workplace, and they then all use it. So that's one example. On page 7 of your handout is another example. So in this one, there's space for the RTO to say what they have done, and there is space for the workplace to actually also talk about what has happened. So if we look at the RTO columns first, the first two, so they're saying what content they've actually delivered while the student has been with them. In this case, they've done the risk assessment process and tools, how to conduct a risk assessment, risks for a manufacturing workplace. And here's the really important bit, because in the next bit of this, they're saying, what do we want you, the workplace, to talk to the student about when they come back to you? And what do we want this student to be practicing with you when they're in your workplace? So they have put a series of dot points in there to structure and help the workplace give the student the experience that they need. So for example, they want you to talk about your risk assessment process, the forms that you use in your workplace, control measures, and so on. So the workplace goes through, and if they've done those things, they tick them. And then they make a comment about what the student is really good at, what they might need some more help with, and general comments. In this case, they're a great communicator. They have interpersonal skills, but they don't seem to understand the concept of control measures, in particular how a control measure might impact the risk rating table. So what that then does is it allows us to think about what actions might need to be taken in the learning process to help address the ideas or those things that the student is missing. So the student has a voice in this. They get to put their comments in there. So they have said, you know, I've actually found this topic really challenging and I don't feel I understand it properly. It's a learner calling out for help. So the required actions for the RTO is to provide the student with some additional information and organise the time within a week of receipt to discuss it. They have got a time scheduled in there, and at the next site visit they're going to do this, and again there is a time frame sitting on that, and we're able to close out this tracking by saying they focused on that, looked at lots of examples in the workplace and seems to have a better understanding. The supervisor is going to sit in on the workplace visit to assist. So that's another way to capture it. And I'm just having a look at the comments we've got there. Yes, I like the second version too, Catherine, but it's what works. What works for your organisations. And yes, potentially there could be electronic platforms such as Ready Skills that might be able to capture this type of information. The most important thing about however it is we do this is that it is two-way, or three-way really, that in fact the RTO, the employer and the student are actually sharing information about what they know, what they're practicing and what they need to work on. And that's what allows us to structure effective training for them. So this is an overview of the kinds of questions that whatever platform you wanted to use to do this, you would want to be asking. So what has the student been learning with the RTO? What do we want the workplace to talk to the student about or show them, get them practicing? What kind of feedback do we want about their progress? What kind of time frame should that feedback occur in? And what does the learner think about their progress? What do they need help with to actually get them to the point where they're competent and capable workers? There's also other situations that might actually come into play here, and sometimes when you're delivering training, there are things that impact your ability to be able to deliver the training, and COVID's a classic example of that, where we might lose access to a workplace. So in those circumstances, either we don't have the capability to do it internally or we can't get to where we need to get to deliver this training. Often RTOs enter into some form of agreement with a third party, which could be the workplace, to actually deliver the training. So in essence, we're outsourcing the training. And if we do that, there's another layer of regulation that comes into play. So it's not to say don't do it, it's a valuable tool, but when you do it, there's a whole lot of planning that has to be in place for you to use third-party arrangements. So TAC has a fact sheet on third-party arrangements, which hopefully isn't a 30-party arrangement. And in that fact sheet, which Mel has just popped a link to in the chat box, there's a lot of information in there about what your obligations are as an RTO, and will help you clarify what you need to do additionally if you use that kind of approach. So We've talked quite a lot about the learner in this, but of course you've also got a workplace that's there helping you. And there's things that you can do as the RTO to help support the workplace. Things like having a really clear and targeted induction so that that workplace understands what the requirements and structure of the program are, and it's not just your contact person. So anyone who's actually going to be involved in helping that learner in the workplace needs to understand what their role is, making the information that you provide to the workplace really simple and easy to use. You don't have to give them your training and assessment strategy, like an overview of that in non-trainer speak might be a far more useful document. Ongoing and consistent communication about the program with the workplace is important, as well as ongoing reviews and feedback about process or progress and the tailoring of the learning and the practice when that's required. And you also have a role where you could help develop and support the workplace staff who are involved in training so that they become better mentors and workplace helpers for you in the delivery of training. So we have talked about a whole lot of information today, and I'm just going to ask you to do one last thing for us, is to reflect on your own training practice. Given the information that we've had today, what are you going to pay more attention to or review and improve in your own practice? We want to thank you so much for joining the session today and for all of the fabulous input that you have put into the chat box. We hope that you are able to use this information, and Amanda, just when you think you didn't have all the information, we've got some more for you. So the last page in your handout has got a whole lot of links to some further information that you might use, and we would encourage you to read widely, think deeply, and stay curious in regards to your own practice. Thank you so much for coming today. Tax contact details are on this slide. If you've got any feedback for us about the webinar, how you think we could improve it, then please provide that feedback to TAC. And we hope we will see you again at some more of our upcoming education program events. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.